Tells voters the truth, no matter how painful. Well, let's find out with the help of three sceptical voters who are joining us from around the English regions and from Mr. Cable himself. And a very warm welcome to the Politics Show. Thank you very much for being with us. And I think that probably part of your reputation, part of your party's reputation, is that you use moderate language and that you are kind of restrained in some of the things you say. And yet Nick Clegg stands up at a news conference and says a vote for the other two parties is a vote for corrupt politics. Is corrupt the right word to use?
Well, I think he was referring to something very specific, which is the way that we fund political parties, and it is corrupt. And all parties have been damaged by the system whereby rich individuals...
Therefore, it's all parties,
yes.
not just...
Let me just deal with the issue of party funding. All parties have been damaged by that system. We have tried to change it, and we pressed very heavily for reform of party funding in such a way that there are limits to individual donations, limits to what are spending, and the attempts to change the system were blocked by the other two parties. The Tories, because they have these exceedingly rich individuals like Lord Ashcroft, and the Labour Party because they depended on...
a couple of million quid from a party donor who's been convicted of all sorts of things.
Absolutely.
You haven't handed that money back?
That's why I made the comment I made.
But then the corruption is of all three parties, not just...
The system was corrupt, and we have tried to change it because it's wrong. And we've been blocked from changing it because of the vested interest in the other two parties. And I think that was what the point that Nick was trying to make.
OK, but wouldn't it have been perhaps better to have described it as there is a corrupt system of finance, but actually to say that Labour and the Conservatives are corrupt, but you are cleaner than clean and whiter than white, is incorrect?
He wasn't saying that the other two parties are corrupt. We're saying that the system is corrupt.
That's exactly what he said.
It needs reform.
It would be a vote for voting Labour or Conservative would be a vote for corrupt politics.
For the very simple reason that they're resistant to reforming it. And we are arguing for fundamental reform of the system in respect of party funding, in respect, for example, of the corruption we've seen in the House of Commons, the whole expenses crisis. We wanted to take tough action. Right. MPs should be recalled, forced to have by-elections if they abuse parliamentary rules. Those are the reforms that we've been pushing and which have been resisted.
Let me just move on to something else, which is the poster you unveiled this week, and I think we can show it to you, of the reworking of the Labour tax bombshell. This is the Tory VAT bombshell. You would pay £389 more a year in VAT under the Conservatives. Where does that figure come from?
Well, it comes from taking some of the spending commitments that the Tories have made in respect of taxation, in other words, their inheritance tax pledge, and particularly their commitment to cut national insurance, which they've made a big deal over the last year. We know from experience that when they're...
Sorry to interrupt, but the poster says you would pay, not that you might pay. Well, the Tories have said that they will not raise.
Well, it's a reasonable prediction based on their past form, that when they're forced to...
But you passed it off as fact.
We passed it off as a reasonable prediction of the way they would behave.
The poster doesn't say this is a reasonable prediction. Yes. This says you would pay. I mean, I just kind of come back to you want
I'm trying to put this in fairly simple language. The Tories have an enormous problem to do explaining how they would cover this big budget deficit, which they've been talking about incessantly for months. They've got no explanation of how they'd do it. They're now making... Let me just finish the argument. They're now making extra spending commitments. We're saying, on the basis of their past history, when they've been in government, the way they deal with this is to increase value-added tax. That's all we're saying.
Would you rule out raising VAT?
No, I don't. It's
so
something...
therefore your position is no different to them?
It is fundamentally different, because we've taken the view that if you're tackling the problems of the big budget deficit, you've got to spell out, you've got to look first of all at public spending. And we've tried to do that, and we've identified quite a substantial list of commitments that we would make in public spending, which are much more explicit than the Conservatives. Let me just finish the argument. The commitments that we would make, the Conservatives haven't been willing to do that. The problem is if you're not willing to do that...
And the figure you reach is £389, not £390, not £388, not £388.50.
That's an attempt... Obviously it's an approximation, that's simple common sense, but that's the
but then it's not truthful.
Of course it is. We're talking about a sum which equates to the gap that they are unable to explain.
Sure, but then you are fighting a campaign saying we are not the corrupt politics, and you're using exactly the same tactics. I mean, let's leave aside whether or whether not there is a black hole in the Tories' finances. Leave that to one side. You don't know factually that they are going to raise VAT. That is your conjecture.
It is a conjecture, and it's a reasonable assumption, and I wouldn't claim any more than that.
And that £389 is a rough
it's a
figure
ballpark. It's a ballpark estimate of what it would require in order to fill that gap, and it seems a reasonable way of expressing that argument.
Sure, but then it is not clearly absolutely truthful that is what they would do. It doesn't say anywhere on the poster, this is your conjecture. I'm just making the point that I know that this happens in election campaigns. Right. But the Liberal Democrats are meant to be a bit cleaner, a bit kind of more honest about these things.
If we published a poster with footnotes and notes to editors and what this figure actually means, it would be regarded as rather ridiculous, wouldn't it? We're trying to get across a basic, simple message that the Conservatives have made very large commitments in respect of tax cutting and in respect of spending, which they're not willing to explain how they would do it. That, in our view, is fundamentally dishonest politics. We tried to suggest what in practice that would mean, and it almost certainly would mean a big increase in value-added tax. We're just trying to illustrate it.
It's a good piece of propaganda.
I would prefer to be talking positively about the things we would do in tax policy.
Well, it's your poster. This is your first poster.
And it makes a perfectly reasonable point.
If you would rather be talking about the positive message, that you could have said, no, I'm sorry, let's have a poster that deals with what we are going to do.
We're having our manifesto launched this week, and you'll be able to read all the positive things that we're going to do, and I'm very happy to talk about it.
OK, let's move on. Let's bring in Kate Griffiths, who is in Linton, in Cambridgeshire. And Kate Griffiths, I think you have a question now for Vince Cable.
Yes, I do. Thank you very much. The national deficit is absolutely huge at the moment, and my concern is that it needs to be taken. We need to deal with it immediately, which means massive cuts in order to ensure our current credit rating. And I'd be very interested to know how the Liberal Democrats are going to address this matter.
Kate, thank you for that. Yeah, massive cuts. That was a phrase that Nick Clegg himself used.
Yes, I think we do acknowledge, and you're quite right, that there are going to have to be very substantial discipline in public spending. And we've gone rather further than other parties have in identifying specific items. We've got a list of 15 billion, substantial sum of money, of which 5 would be allocated to our spending priorities, particularly in respect of schools. The other 10 billion would be used to pay down the deficit. And I can go through the list if you like. It is, first of all, discipline in respect of public sector pay. We're also saying that certain welfare entitlements, Child Trust Fund scheme would go, which a lot of people like, but we suggest it's got to go as a matter of priority.
And those have been announced. What other measures?
We'd move on to that to some of the big defence contracts. We've identified the Eurofighter contract. In the longer term, we get rid of the Trident missile system. We want to get rid of some of the vast bureaucracy that's been created, for example, around local government, where literally billions are spent with civil servants box ticking, supervising local authorities. We want to get rid of the surveillance state. This is ID cards, it's the new generation of biometric passports, the national identity database associated with that. There's a long list, I could add more, which takes us up to something of the order of 15 billion. It's a very substantial amount. But your question was also about timing. I think you asked me, why don't we just get on with this immediately? I think what is required in terms of the creditworthiness of the country is that the people who do lend us money, the international markets, have to be absolutely persuaded that we've got a serious and credible plan to do it. Doing it tomorrow, vast cuts in public spending tomorrow, could actually make the situation worse, because what would then happen is it would push the country into a recession, it would widen the deficit further and make the problem worse.
OK, Kate.